The mining colony on Kepler 442b was a place where hope came to die. And Elias Vance had been rotting there for 3 long years when everything changed forever. Remembered the day the Concordat soldiers dragged him from Earth's last free settlement. Remembered how they laughed at his attempts to fight back. Remembered how they called humans vermin as they loaded him onto the prison transport like cargo now. He spent his days breaking rocks in tunnels so deep that sunlight was just a memory. Surrounded by other humans who had stopped dreaming of freedom long ago, alien guards watched them with cold eyes. Their scaled Veltari, faces showing no emotion as they cracked their electric whips against anyone who moved too slowly. Elias had learned to keep his head down and his mouth shut. But he never stopped watching and waiting for his chance. The other prisoners thought he was broken like them. But inside his chest burned a fire that grew stronger with every humiliation he suffered. He made mental notes of guard rotations and supply schedules, memorized the layout of every tunnel and corridor, and studied the weaknesses of the aliens who thought themselves his masters. The Veltari were tall and powerful with thick scales that could stop a knife. But Elias noticed they were slow to react when surprised, and their necks were soft beneath their jaws. The Concordat had ruled the galaxy for 10,000 years, and they had grown comfortable in their power, never imagining that a lowly human could pose any real threat, that arrogance would be their downfall. Elias promised himself every night as he lay on his hard cot and stared at the stone ceiling on the day everything changed. A supply frigate made an emergency landing at the colony after suffering engine trouble during a routine delivery run. Elias was part of the work crew assigned to help unload cargo while the ship's engineers made repairs. And his heart began pounding when he saw the opportunity before him. The frigate was small but fast, designed for quick trips between systems, and it carried only a skeleton crew of 12 Veltari soldiers. He spent the first hour memorizing the interior layout as he carried crates up and down the loading ramp, noting where the weapons locker was located and which corridors led to the bridge. The guards paid him no attention because humans were not considered intelligent enough to be dangerous. Just simple animals good for lifting heavy objects. That night, Elias did not sleep, but instead sharpened a piece of titanium scrap against the stone floor of his cell until it had an edge that could cut through flesh. When morning came, he hid the makeshift blade inside his sleeve and waited for his work shift to begin. The loading continued, and Elias moved crates with the same dull expression as always. But his mind was racing through every step of his plan. He struck when one of the guards turned his back to inspect the damaged container, driving the titanium shard into the soft spot beneath the alien's jaw with all his strength. The Veltari died without making a sound, and Elias caught his body before it hit the ground, dragging it behind a stack of crates. His hands were shaking, but not from fear, from excitement that felt almost like joy after 3 years of helpless rage. He took the dead guard's plasma pistol and moved through the ship like a ghost, killing 2 more Veltari before anyone realized something was wrong. The alarm finally sounded when he was halfway to the bridge. But by then he had found the weapons locker and armed himself with a proper rifle. The remaining guards came at him in a rush. Confident that one human could not possibly defeat them in combat, they were wrong. Elias fought with a fury that seemed inhuman, moving faster than they could track and shooting with deadly accuracy despite having no formal training. 3 more Veltari fell before they reached him, and then it was close combat in the narrow corridors where their size became a Elias disadvantage. He killed 2 more with his blade, slipping past their clumsy strikes and finding the weak points in their scales. The last 4 guards tried to barricade themselves on the bridge, but Elias found a maintenance hatch and came at them from above, dropping into their midst like death itself. When the killing was done, he stood alone on the bridge, covered in alien blood, and breathing hard as he stared at the control panels. He had never flown a ship before, but the Concordat used standardized systems across their fleet. And he had watched the pilots during his transport to the colony. It took him 2 hours to figure out the basic controls and another hour to unlock the navigation computer. But finally, the frigate lifted off and rose through the atmosphere. Colony's defense systems tried to shoot him down, but they were old and poorly maintained. And Elias pushed the engines to full power as he raced toward the stars behind him. The mining colony grew smaller and smaller until it vanished from sight forever. He set a course for the unmarked reaches, a region of space where the Concordat's authority was weak and pirates and smugglers made their homes. As he flew, he accessed the ship's communication system and began listening to Concordat broadcasts, learning everything he could about the galaxy he planned to burn. The news channels barely mentioned the escape from Kepler 442b, treating it as a minor incident, not worth serious attention. One human had stolen a small frigate. That was all, and the Concordat had more important matters to worry about. Elias smiled at their arrogance as he renamed his ship the Debt Collector. Using the navigation computer, he thought about all the humans still suffering in chains across 1,000 worlds. Thought about the children born into slavery who would never know freedom. The Concordat would learn to fear humanity. He swore to himself, even if he had to teach them that lesson, one dead alien at a Tadelian at a war. Even if he had to teach them that lesson, one dead alien at a time. He spent the next 3 months learning everything about his ship and making modifications to its weapons and engines. The unmarked reaches were full of smugglers willing to trade goods and information for the right price. And Elias sold some of the cargo to buy better equipment. He also began recruiting, seeking out other escaped humans and offering them a place on his crew. Most thought he was crazy when he explained his plan to wage war against the entire Concordat. But if you saw the same fire in his eyes that burned in their own hearts. His first real raid came 4 months after his escape, when he attacked a Concordat cargo hauler carrying luxury goods to a Velthari noble. The hauler's crew surrendered without a fight, too shocked that anyone would dare such an attack. And Elias took everything of value before letting them go. He always left survivors, so they could spread stories about the human pirate who struck from nowhere and vanished like smoke within 6 months. His name had spread across the sector, and humans on colony worlds whispered about him in the dark. They said he was a demon that the Concordat could not catch, a ghost who appeared and disappeared at will, a sign that humanity's suffering would not last forever. Elias heard these stories and understood their power, understood that hope was a weapon more dangerous than any plasma rifle. He began leaving messages at the sites of his raids, simple words that would spread from mouth to mouth across the stars. Humanity remembers was his favorite, short enough to be scratched into walls and repeated by slaves who could not read. The Concordat still did not take him seriously, considering him a minor nuisance that local security forces could handle. They would learn their mistakes soon enough. Elias thought as he plotted his next attack and dreamed of the day when the galaxy would tremble at the sound of his name. For now he was just one human with one ship and a handful of crew. But empires had fallen to less. The fire inside him was spreading, and soon it would become a blaze that no force in the universe could extinguish. High Arbiter Thesnev of Velthari Dominion stared at the reports on his desk and felt something he had not experienced in centuries, a cold knot of worry forming in his bulge stomach. The human pirate had been active for nearly a year now, and the situation was no longer something that could be ignored or dismissed as a minor problem. 17 ships had been raided in the past 3 months alone, and the pattern of attacks made no sense to any of the analysts who studied them. 1 week, the humans struck at wealthy merchant vessels carrying precious metals and gems. The next, he attacked worthless cargo haulers that contained nothing but food supplies and machine parts. The crystalline moth had run their famous probability assessments on the data. Their vast network minds processing every variable and searching for the optimization strategy behind the attacks. They found nothing. No logical pattern, no predictable behavior. Just chaos that seemed almost random, but clearly was not. The human does not behave like a rational actor, the moth representative reported to the emergency council session, their crystalline body humming with confusion. Every species in the Concordat follows mathematical principles in their decision-making, maximizing benefit and minimizing risk. But this creature operates on a different calculus entirely. Thiessen listened with growing unease as the other ruling species shared their own findings and theories about the pirate called Elias Vance. Telepathic Orani had attempted to create a psychological profile based on interviews with survivors of his raids, trying to understand what drove this strange creature. Their lead researcher had actually recoiled during the presentation, her pale face showing genuine distress as she described what she had discovered. The human mind is unlike anything we have encountered, she said in a trembling voice. That made the council chamber fall silent. They possess a capacity for something we have no word for, a willingness to accept personal destruction in pursuit of abstract goals, a comfort with death that borders on the pathological. Are you saying the human is insane? Asked Thiessen, hoping for a simple explanation that would make the problem easier to solve. No, Biorani replied, shaking her head slowly. That is what disturbs us most. The human is perfectly rational within his own framework. He simply values things that we do not understand. The Valkyrie representative at the council, a military commander named Varentis, slammed his scaled fist against the table in frustration. Enough of this mystical nonsense, he growled, his voice echoing through the chamber. The human is flesh and blood. He can be killed. We simply need to commit proper resources to hunting him down. The problem, said the moth representative in their calm, harmonic voice, is that the human has begun recruiting and his forces are no longer limited to a single ship. This news sent a ripple of alarm through the council as data projections appeared in the air above the table showing the growth of the pirate fleet. What had started as one stolen frigate had grown to 7 vessels crewed by humans and members of other species that the Concordat had conquered or displaced. The Kreth were there, those insectoid beings whose homeworld had been strip-mined for resources 3 centuries ago. Leaving their people scattered and homeless, the Sealand had joined as well. That proud warrior race who had been neutered through genetic modification after their failed uprising against Concordat rule. Even some Thornback mercenaries had signed on. Those hulking reptilian creatures who normally worked as hired muscle for the highest bidder. He is building an army, Thiessen said slowly as the full scope of the threat finally became clear to him. Not an army, corrected the Orani researcher, a cause. And that is far more dangerous. The council debated for hours about how to respond to this unprecedented situation. Some argued for negotiation, offering the human whatever he wanted in exchange for peace. But no one could determine what he actually wanted. Others suggested that the problem would solve itself, that the pirate's luck would eventually run out, and he would be killed in one of his reckless attacks. Vorenus pushed for a military solution, a massive show of force that would crush the rebellion before it could spread any further. We should also consider addressing the source of the problem, said the Valkyrie civilian representative, speaking the words that everyone had been thinking but no one wanted to say. The remaining human colonies are a breeding ground for dissent. Perhaps it is time to implement a final solution. The chamber fell silent as the implications of that suggestion hung in the air like poison gas. The Concordat had destroyed species before when they proved too troublesome to control. It was not unprecedented, just unpleasant. But before anyone could respond to the proposal, an aide rushed into the chamber with urgent news that changed everything. The pirate has attacked the diplomatic envoy to the Kreth remnant worlds. The aide gasped, out of breath from running. He did not steal anything or kill anyone, but he broadcast a message on all open channels that is now spreading across the sector. The message was played for the council, and Elias Vance's voice filled the chamber with words that seemed to burn in the air. "Humanity remembers," he said, his tone calm and cold. "We remember every colony that was enslaved, every child that was taken, every life that was stolen. We remember the promises that were broken and the treaties that were lies. We remember being called vermin by those who feared what we might become. This message is for every human who still draws breath under Concordat chains. Your suffering has not been forgotten. Your patience will be rewarded. The debt will be collected." The recording ended, and the council sat in stunned silence for a long moment before the arguments began. A new Thessan barely listened to the debate raging around him, because he was thinking about something the Orani researcher had said earlier. The human valued things they did not understand, and that made him unpredictable in ways their models could not account for. What did a creature want when it did not care about wealth or power or even survival? The answer came to Thessan with terrible clarity. Revenge. The human wanted revenge, and there was no price that would satisfy that hunger. 3 weeks later, the pirate fleet ambushed a Vulthari supply convoy and destroyed 2 warships that had been sent as escorts. The battle should have been impossible. 7 small vessels against 2 fully armed destroyers. But the humans fought like demons possessed by madness. They rammed their ships into the larger vessels, used asteroids as weapons, turned the very debris of the battle into deadly projectiles. 1 pirate ship was lost in the fighting, but the Vulthari destroyers were both crippled beyond repair. Their crews forced to evacuate in escape pods. The message sent after the battle was brief. "We can die, but we will make you bleed first. Is the math acceptable to you?" Varentis read that message and felt something he had never experienced in his long military career. A chill running down his spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. He began planning the largest military operation in 3 centuries. An armada that would hunt down the human pirate and end this threat once and for all. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, humans in chains heard whispers about the pirate who defied the Concordat, and one they heard that he was building a fleet, that he was freeing slaves, that he had sworn to make the galaxy pay for what it had done to humanity. Hope spread like fire through dry grass. Quiet but unstoppable, burning in hearts that had long ago accepted despair on distant colony worlds. Human slaves began to plan and prepare, waiting for the signal that they knew would come. The Concordat had ruled the galaxy for 10,000 years through fear and overwhelming force. But they had never faced an enemy who welcomed death. They did not understand that humans had a gift for turning weakness into strength, for finding victory in sacrifice, for burning everything down rather than accepting defeat. Elias Vance stood on the bridge of the debt collector and watched the stars wheel past the viewport. Thinking about the future he was building, he knew he would probably not live to see humanity free. But that did not matter because the fire he had started would burn long after he was gone. "Status report," he said to his crew, his voice steady and calm despite the weight of destiny pressing down upon his shoulders. 3 new ships have joined the fleet. His first mate replied, a scarred human woman who had escaped from a breeding colony. "And we have received messages of support from 17 human settlements." Elias nodded and allowed himself a small smile as he plotted their next attack against a target that would shake the very foundations of Concordat power, the mathematics of madness. The aliens called it, but Elias knew it by another name, hope. Admiral Varentis stood on the command deck of his flagship and surveyed the armada assembled before him with fierce pride swelling in his chest. 200 warships stretched across the void of space. The largest military force the Concordat had mobilized in over 3 centuries of peaceful Dominion destroyers and cruisers and carriers filled his viewscreen, their hulls gleaming with the power of a civilization that had ruled the galaxy since before humanity learned to make fire. "Today we end this farce," Varentis announced to his officers, his voice carrying the absolute confidence of a predator who had never known defeat. "The human vermin have hidden in the Shroud Nebula like the rats they are, and we will flush them out and destroy them utterly." His fleet moved forward in perfect formation, engines burning bright against the darkness as they approached the swirling clouds of gas and dust that marked the nebulas. Edge intelligence reports indicated that the pirate fleet numbered no more than 15 vessels. A pitiful force that should be crushed within horse. Varentis had brought 200 ships because he wanted to send a message, not just to humans, but to every species in the Concordat. This was what happened to those who challenged the natural order of things. This was the price of defiance. The armada entered the nebula, and immediately the problems began as sensors filled with static and communication. Channels crackled with interference. Expected interference from the nebulas. "Electromagnetic field," reported the sensor officer. "We are compensating, but accuracy is reduced by 40%. Varentis nodded, unconcerned by this minor inconvenience, because his force was so overwhelming that precision hardly mattered. What he did not know was that Elias Vance had spent 3 months preparing this trap, seeding the nebula with thousands of surprises. The first mines detonated against the lead destroyer's shields, not powerful enough to destroy the ship, but enough to send it spinning off. Of course, more explosions followed in rapid succession as the carefully hidden weapons activated throughout the fleet's formation ships began to scatter, trying to avoid the invisible threats that surrounded them. And the perfect formation dissolved into chaos. "All ships hold position," Varentis commanded. But his voice was lost in the static as communication disruptors hidden among the nebula's clouds came online. Each ship could only see and hear its nearest neighbors now. The Grand Armada, reduced to isolated clusters, blind to the larger battle that was when the pirate fleet struck, emerging from the nebula's depths like ghosts made of fire and fury. They did not attack in formation or follow any recognizable tactical doctrine. Instead, each ship seemed to act independently, striking wherever the confusion was greatest. The debt collector itself appeared directly behind a Concordat carrier, its weapons tearing into the larger ships' engines before vanishing back into the swirling clouds. Varentis watched in horror as his sensor display filled with damage reports and distress calls from across his scattered fleet. "Regroup," he shouted into the static. "All ships fall back to the nebula's edge and regroup." But retreat was not so simple when you could not see where you were going, and the false sensor signatures Elias had planted led ship after ship deeper into the trap. 2 cruisers fired on each other in the confusion, each one convinced the other was an enemy vessel based on corrupted identification signals. A destroyer captain panicked and ordered a blind jump to hyperspace, his ship tearing itself apart when it hit a hidden gravity mine. The pirate ships continued their dance of death, appearing and disappearing, striking and fading, never staying in one place long enough to be targeted. Hours passed, and the proud armada bled, losing ship after ship to mines and ambushes and friendly fire. Varentis finally managed to rally 60 ships around his flagship and fight his way back to the nebula's edge, leaving the rest to their fate. When the final count came in, he had lost 63 warships, nearly a third of his force, against an enemy that numbered less than 20. The pirate fleet had lost only 2 vessels in the entire engagement, a ratio of losses that should have been mathematically Impossible Varantes sat alone in his quarters that night and wrote his after-action report with hands that trembled despite his efforts to keep them steady. The human does not fight to win, he wrote, the words feeling like ash in his mouth. He fights to make us bleed. There is no mathematical counter to spite. He submitted the report, knowing that it would likely end his career. But he no longer cared about such things. Something had broken inside him during that battle. Some fundamental certainty about the order of the universe. He had seen his ships burn and his soldiers die against an enemy that should have been nothing more than vermin to be exterminated, and he had seen the faces of the human pilots in those brief moments when their ships came close enough to be visible, seen the joy in their eyes as they died, taking his people with them. What kind of creature smiled while dying? What kind of mind found happiness in mutual destruction? The Concordat Council received Varantes' report with stunned disbelief that quickly turned to rage and then to something that felt uncomfortably like fear. They ordered another fleet assembled. This time, 300 ships, with orders to pursue the pirates wherever they fled. But before the new armada could launch, Elias Vance delivered his most devastating attack yet. One that used no weapons at all. Broadcast signal overrode every communication channel in 3 sectors, forcing itself onto screens in homes and offices in government buildings. The footage that played showed things that the Concordat had worked very hard to keep hidden from the general. Public mass graves on human colony worlds. Thousands of bodies dumped into pits and covered with chemical burns to prevent identification, breeding facilities where human women were kept like livestock, forced to produce children who were sold to various species as novelties or servants. Medical experiments conducted on human subjects, their screams recorded and cataloged by math researchers studying the limits of human pain tolerance. Forced sterilization programs designed to slowly reduce the human population to more manageable numbers over generations. Children torn from their parents and shipped to distant worlds where they would never see their families again. The footage was hours long and documented atrocities spanning decades. Crimes that the Concordat had committed while telling the galaxy that humans were treated fairly. Elias appeared at the end of the broadcast, his face calm and his eyes burning with cold fire as he spoke directly to the watching galaxy. "This is what your civilization has done to my people," he said, his voice carrying no anger, only a terrible patience. "This is the debt that must be collected. Not by me alone, but by every being in this galaxy who still has a conscience. Ask yourselves what your government has hidden from you. Ask what crimes have been committed in your name. And ask yourselves this: if they did this to us, what would they do to you if you ever became inconvenient?" The broadcast ended and the galaxy erupted into chaos as species that had accepted Concordat rule began demanding answers. The Kreth remnant worlds declared open support for the human rebellion, their leaders citing the destruction of their own homeworld as proof of Concordat cruelty. Sealan communities across a dozen systems began riots that required military intervention to suppress, and many soldiers refused to fire on their own people, even within the ruling species. Voices of dissent emerged from those who had not known the full extent of what their government had done. The Concordat tried to claim the footage was fabricated, but Elias had included enough verifiable details that their lies fell apart under scrutiny. Investigative journalists began digging into classified records and finding evidence that confirmed everything that broadcast had shown on Earth's surviving colonies. Humans stopped whispering about the pirate who defied the Concordat. They began shouting his name in the streets, chanting it during work shifts, scratching it into walls where guards could not see. Vance became more than a name. It became a symbol, a rallying cry, a promise that suffering would not last forever. The Concordat, understood too late that they were no longer fighting a pirate but a movement. And movements could not be killed with warships. Elias watched the chaos spreading across the galaxy from his hidden base and allowed himself to feel something he had not felt in years: satisfaction. Not victory, because that was still far away, but satisfaction that the truth was finally known. The galaxy could no longer pretend that humanity's suffering was acceptable, could no longer look away and claim ignorance. Every being who watched that footage would have to choose a side, and many would choose the side that did not bury children in unmarked graves. "What now, Captain?" asked his first mate, as reports of uprisings and protests flooded their communication channels. Elias smiled, a cold expression that held no warmth but plenty of determination as he plotted the next phase of his war. "Now we give them something to rally around," he said. "Now we show them that the Concordat can bleed, and then we make them bleed until they beg for peace on our terms." The fire was spreading faster than even Elias had dared to hope, and soon it would consume everything. The message arrived on a secure channel that only the highest members of the Concordat Council could access, and it sent shockwaves through the halls of power. The 5 High Arbiters read the words with a mixture of hope and suspicion, knowing that this might be their last chance to end the crisis peacefully. "The human is willing to negotiate," announced High Arbiter Thiessen to the emergency session, his voice carefully neutral despite his inner turmoil. "He has agreed to meet aboard Nexus Prime to discuss terms for ending hostilities." The council chamber erupted in debate as representatives from the 5 ruling species argued about whether this was a trap or a genuine opportunity. Some believed that the pirate had finally realized he could not win against the full might of the Concordat and was seeking a way out. Others suspected that he was planning something, though they could not imagine what one human could accomplish on the most heavily defended station in the galaxy. "The terms of the meeting are specific," Thiessen continued when the noise died down. "He will come alone and unarmed, and he requests safe passage guaranteed by all 5 ruling species." "And what does he want in return for peace?" asked the Moth representative, their crystalline form pulsing with curiosity. "Sovereignty for humanity's remaining colonies, amnesty for his crew and all human resistance fighters, and a non-voting seat on this council for a human representative." The demands were outrageous by Concordat standards, but surprisingly modest given everything that had happened. A non-voting seat meant humans would have a voice, but no real power, and sovereignty for the colonies still left them dependent on Concordat trade routes and protection. "He asks for so little," mused the Orani representative, her telepathic senses tingling with unease. "Which makes me wonder what he really wants." "Perhaps he simply knows he cannot win," suggested Varentis, who had been allowed to remain as military advisor despite his defeat. "Perhaps he is a realist underneath all that fury." The council debated for 3 days before finally agreeing to the meeting, each species sending their High Arbiter to demonstrate the importance of the negotiations. Security preparations were unprecedented, with every system on Nexus Prime checked and rechecked for threats. The human would be scanned repeatedly before being allowed into the council chamber, and armed guards would surround him at all times. Nothing could possibly go wrong. The security chief assured the council the station was impenetrable. What no one considered was the human factor. The 17 human slaves who worked in the maintenance sections of Nexus Prime, they had been there for years, invisible to the powerful beings who walked the station's golden corridors. Just another part of the furniture, but they had been waiting. Recruited by agents of the rebellion, long before Elias Vance had even escaped from his prison. Colony each one had memorized their part of the plan. Spending years in quiet preparation for a day they had begun to think would never come when Elias Vance arrived at Nexus Prime. He was calm and composed despite the dozens of weapons pointed at him. The scans found nothing dangerous on his person. No weapons, no explosives, no hidden devices of any kind. He was escorted through gleaming corridors to the council chamber, passing by maintenance workers who did not meet his eyes, but felt their hearts pounding. The chamber itself was a masterpiece of Concordat architecture. A vast space where the 5 high arbiters sat on thrones of crystal and gold. Elias walked to the center of the room and stood alone before the most powerful beings in the galaxy. Showing no fear, "You have asked for this meeting," Thiessen said, looking down at the small human who had caused so much chaos. "Speak your piece." Elias looked up at the assembled rulers and spoke in a clear voice that carried to every corner of the chamber. "I came here to deliver a message," he said. "Not to negotiate." "What message?" demanded the Velthari High Arbiter, his scales rippling with irritation. "That you are not safe," Elias replied simply. "That all your power and all your armies cannot protect you from those you have wronged." "Is that a threat?" asked Thiessen, gesturing for the guards to move closer. "No," said Elias with a smile that made several guards flinch despite their training. "It is a demonstration. Deep in the station's core, 17 human maintenance workers pressed buttons they had been waiting years to press. The explosion started in the reactor section. Carefully placed charges that did not destroy the reactors but damaged the containment. Systems alarms screamed throughout Nexus Prime as emergency protocols activated, and the station began to shake from secondary explosions. The guards in the council chamber looked around in confusion, torn between protecting the high arbiters and responding to the crisis. Elias moved in that moment of distraction, his body uncoiling like a spring as he launched himself at the nearest throne. He had no weapons, but he did not need them. His hands finding the Velthari High Arbiter's throat and squeezing with all his strength. The guards fired, but Elias used the dying arbiter's body as a shield, absorbing plasma bolts as he dragged his victim to the ground in the chaos. He reached the Moth High Arbiter next, his fists shattering their crystalline form before they could call for help. The remaining arbiters fled toward the emergency exits while guards swarmed Elias from all directions. He fought like a man who knew he was already dead, like someone who had made peace with his fate long ago. 3 more guards fell to his desperate attacks before they finally brought him down. Plasma fire tearing through his body. Elias collapsed on the sacred floor of the Concordat's seat of power, his blood pooling beneath him in a growing stain. Thiessen approached the dying human, staring down with a mixture of horror and fascination at this creature who had done the impossible. "Why?" the High Arbiter asked, genuinely unable to understand. "You must have known you would die." Elias looked up with eyes that were already growing dim, but his smile never wavered. "I was always going to die," he said, his voice weak but clear. "This way, my death means something." "You have accomplished nothing," Thiessen insisted. "The Concordat will survive this. We will crush your rebellion." "You still do not understand," Elias whispered. "I was never trying to win. I was trying to light a fire." His final broadcast was already transmitting, recorded and set to play the moment the explosions began. His face appeared on every screen in the galaxy, bloody and broken but defiant to the last breath. "I was one human," his recorded voice declared. "One escaped slave with nothing but rage and a stolen ship. I killed 2 of your high arbiters in their own throne room. I burned the heart of your empire. Imagine what happens when we stop asking for permission to exist. To every human watching this, know that your chains are not as strong as you have been taught to believe. To the Concordat, know that this is just the beginning. We will never stop fighting, never stop bleeding you, never accept a peace that leaves us as slaves. My name was Elias Vance, and I die free." The broadcast ended, and across the galaxy, humans who had been watching fell to their knees and wept, not tears of grief, but tears of fierce pride. For they had just witnessed a slave shake the foundations of an empire with nothing but his bare hands. They, Concordat, announced Elias Vance's death with triumph. Declaring that the rebellion was over and order would be restored, they did not understand that they had just made him immortal. That martyrs were far more dangerous than living men on colony worlds where humans labored in chains. His name became a prayer whispered in the dark moments before sleep on free stations where his fleet regrouped. His lieutenants swore oaths of vengeance over recordings of his final moments. Something had changed in the galaxy. Something fundamental that could not be undone by military force or propaganda. Humans had tasted defiance and found it sweeter than surrender. Had seen one of their own bring an empire to its knees, and they wanted more. The Concordat had killed Elias Vance. But in doing so, they had proven everything he had ever said about them. They were afraid of humanity. Afraid enough to need 5 ruling species to govern the galaxy. Afraid enough to enslave and slaughter and oppress if they were afraid. Then they could be beaten. That realization spread like wildfire through human communities across the stars. Transforming grief into determination, Elias had lit his fire. And now it was spreading beyond anything he could have imagined. The throne room of Nexus Prime would be repaired and cleaned. The blood scrubbed from the golden floors, but the stain Elias Vance had left on the Concordat's power would never be washed away. He had proven that their masters could be touched, could be hurt, could be killed, and that changed everything. The Concordat expected that killing Elias Vance would end the rebellion, that humans would see the futility of resistance and return to their proper place. They were catastrophically wrong in the days following his death. Something extraordinary happened across every world where humans lived in chains. They stopped being afraid on the Mayan colony of Terrath 7. Human workers seized control of the processing plant and broadcast a message declaring themselves free on the agricultural world of Wings Prime. Slaves rose up against their masters with farming tools and stolen weapons, overwhelming guards through sheer numbers on 17 different stations and colonies. Humans who had never dreamed of fighting back suddenly found the courage to act. The Concordat sent troops to restore order, but discovered that suppressing one uprising only sparked 3 more elsewhere. Elias had left behind more than inspiration. He had left behind a network of trained fighters and smuggled weapons spread across the galaxy. His lieutenants took command of the scattered resistance cells and began coordinating attacks. Using codes only they understood, the Vance doctrine emerged as a formal strategy, a way of fighting that embraced human strengths and exploited alien weaknesses. Humans could not match the Concordat in open battle, so they refused to fight openly. Instead, they poisoned water supplies on military bases and collapsed local economies through coordinated sabotage. They turned the Concordat's own bureaucracy into a weapon, filing millions of false reports that clogged communication channels and wasted resources. They infiltrated government buildings as cleaning staff and maintenance workers, gathering intelligence and waiting for opportunities to strike. The Concordat tried extermination, believing that terror would succeed where military force had failed. They glassed 3 human colonies from orbit, turning millions of lives into ash and sending a message they thought would break the human spirit. But the survivors did not surrender. They got angrier. Those who escaped the destruction became the most dedicated fighters in the rebellion. People who had lost everything and had nothing left to fear. They strapped explosives to their bodies and walked into Velthari government buildings, accepting death if it meant taking their enemies with them. They flew cargo ships on suicide runs into military installations. Their final words, always the same: humanity remembers. They made the mathematics of occupation unbearable, forcing the Concordat to spend 10 soldiers protecting every position that humans might attack other species. Watch this transformation. with growing amazement and began to wonder if they too could defy their rulers. The Kreth formally declared war on the Concordat and began reclaiming their strip-mined homeworld with the help of human advisors. The Dion advisors? Salin rose up despite the genetic modifications that were supposed to make them docile, their warriors remembering how to fight. Through sheer force of will, even species that had accepted Concordat rule for millennia began questioning whether the price of peace was worth the cost of their dignity. High Arbiter Thesan watched his empire crumbling and searched desperately for a way to stop it. Believing he ordered more troops deployed, but there were not enough soldiers to pacify every rebellious world at once. He tried negotiation, but human leaders refused to meet with representatives of a government that had just committed genocide. He considered unleashing weapons of mass destruction on every human settlement simultaneously, but his own people rebelled against such extreme measures. The Orani representative resigned from the council in protest, declaring that she could not be part of a government that murdered children. Moth network consciousness began fragmenting as individual crystals developed what could only be described as moral objections to Concordat policy. Even among the Velthari, voices emerged calling for peace and reform. Military officers who had seen too much death and no longer believed victory was possible. 10 years passed and the war showed no signs of ending, only spreading and intensifying with each passing month. The Concordat still held more territory and more ships, but they were bleeding from 1,000 wounds that would not heal. Their economy was collapsing under the strain of endless military deployments and destroyed infrastructure there. Population was growing weary of a conflict that seemed to have no purpose except continued suffering, and still the humans fought on, never surrendering, never accepting terms that did not include full freedom and equality. 15 years after Elias Vance stole a supply frigate from a prison colony, the Concordat Council called an emergency session to discuss an unthinkable option. "We must consider peace," Thesan said, his voice heavy with exhaustion and defeat. "On what terms?" asked the new Velthari High Arbiter, who had replaced the one Elias killed. "On their terms," Thesan replied. And the chamber fell silent as the full weight of those words sank and the Treaty of Ashfall was signed on a neutral station, witnessed by representatives from every major species in the galaxy. Humanity received full representation on the Concordat Council with full voting rights. The penal colonies were liberated and their populations granted citizenship and a newly recognized human sovereignty. Reparations were paid for centuries of slavery and abuse, though no amount of money could truly compensate for what had been lost. The Concordat officially acknowledged its crimes against humanity and established memorial sites on the worlds where atrocities had occurred. For the first time in galactic history, a lesser species had forced the ruling powers to treat them as equals. Through nothing but courage and determination at the signing ceremony, the human representative stood before the assembled diplomats and spoke words that would echo through history. "We did not want this war," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions visible in her eyes. "We wanted only to live in peace, to raise our children, to build our futures. But when peace was not offered, we refused to accept slavery as the alternative. Let this treaty stand as proof that no species is inherently superior to another, that the measure of a people is not their technology or their numbers, but their willingness to fight for what is right. Humanity remembers its suffering, but we also remember how to forgive. Let this be the beginning of a new era, not just for humans, but for every species that has ever been told they were not worthy of respect." The galaxy watched and wondered what the future would hold now that the old order had been so thoroughly shattered. Some feared that humanity would seek revenge, for what had been done to them, that they would become the new oppressors. But the humans surprised everyone by advocating for reforms that benefited all species, not just their own. They pushed for rights protections that applied to every being in the Concordat, for economic systems that did not exploit the weak. They became champions of the very values they had fought for, proving that their rebellion had never been about dominance. 20 years after the Treaty of Ashfall, a statue was erected in the rebuilt halls of Nexus Primate, stood in the very chamber where Elias Vance had died, where his blood had stained the golden floor. The statue showed him as he had been in life, a grinning pirate with determination in his eyes and defiance in his stance, not a conqueror or a diplomat, but a fighter, someone who had refused to accept the unacceptable. The plaque at the base of the statue bore only 2 words. We remember, humans came from across the galaxy to see it, to touch the stone and feel connected to the man who had started everything. They brought their children and told them stories about the age of slavery and the war that ended it. They spoke of sacrifice and courage, of ordinary people who became heroes simply by refusing to be broken, and they reminded each generation that freedom was not given but taken, not preserved by complacency, but by vigilance. The other species of the galaxy developed a new proverb that spread from world to world until everyone knew it. Never corner a human, they said to each other. They would rather burn the galaxy than kneel. It was meant as a warning, but humans took it as a compliment, a recognition of what made them different. They were small and short-lived and technologically primitive by galactic standards, but they had something that the ancient civilizations of the stars had forgotten long ago. They had fire in their hearts, a refusal to accept limits, a capacity for sacrifice that terrified those who understood it. Elias Vance had been one human, with one ship and nothing to lose. He had shaken the foundations of a 10,000-year empire and changed the course of galactic history. His legacy was not just freedom for humanity, but a reminder to every species that power was not permanent, that empires could fall to those they underestimated. The mathematics of spite could overcome any odds. On the anniversary of his death, humans across the galaxy paused for a moment of silence. They remembered the vermin who stole stars, and they smiled.